The room shook before anyone understood what had happened. A loud crash, metal trays clattering, a sharp gasp cutting through the cafeteria air. Every head turned at once. At the center of the chaos stood a young black woman, her breathing tight, her eyes burning with a mixture of shock and restraint. Food and shattered plates surrounded her boots like debris from an explosion. Her knuckles were already swelling from the impact she had just endured. Across from her, the cop who had swung first was still tightening his jaw, still wearing the smug confidence of a man who believed no one would question him. His uniform was crisp, gleaming under the fluorescent lights, while hers was nothing more than a torn tank top and camouflage pants, clothing that made her look powerless in comparison, even though her posture carried a quiet, restrained strength. Her face trembled not from weakness, but from the weight of being attacked in a room full of authority figures who didn't see her as human. Her jaw tightened, her shoulders locked. Her fist stayed low, almost glued to her sides, as if she were fighting the urge to defend herself. Around them, a semicircle of officers watched. Some smirked, some folded their arms, none stepped forward. The atmosphere thickened, stale cafeteria heat mixed with the sour tension of silent approval. A feeling spread through the room, the kind that tells a person they are surrounded yet completely alone. The cop straightened his uniform and took a slow step toward her, closing the gap with a stare that said she didn't belong, didn't deserve to stand there, didn't deserve safety. She held her breath. Her heartbeat thudded against her ribs. Her palms tingled with controlled fear. This wasn't the moment she broke. It was the moment she realized breaking might be her only choice. Far above, a buzzing fluorescent light flickered, strobing the scene like a warning no one wanted to hear. Only one question lingered in the air, unspoken yet roaring inside every witness. How far would he go before anyone stopped him? No one knew the woman he targeted was trained to survive battles far worse than this room. Long before the cafeteria floor turned into a battlefield, she had learned how to survive rooms just like this. Rooms where people judged her before she spoke. Rooms where authority measured worth by skin tone, not skill. Her name was Lena Ward. To them, just another outsider. To the right people, a ghost, an unseen force trained to operate where cameras couldn't follow and fear never won. But none of that showed on her face now. Only exhaustion. A quiet bite mark of sleepless nights beneath her eyes. And a faint streak of dried training dust still clinging to her shoulder. Proof of a long morning spent pushing herself harder than anyone in this room would ever know. Her body language was deceptively still. Shoulders slightly angled, knees flexed just enough to catch her balance, fingers twitching as if responding to muscle memory engraved over years of drills. She looked like a woman fighting herself more than anyone else, fighting the instinct to react, to defend, to end this confrontation before it escalated. But escalation had already begun hours earlier, long before the punch. It started the moment she stepped into the building. The stares, the whispers, the security guard who looked her up and down before telling her she must be lost. The officers who blocked hallways with their shoulders just enough for her to feel the message. You don't belong here. She had come undercover. Her credentials sealed, her mission classified. The local precinct had no idea who she truly was, and that anonymity, normally her greatest shield, felt like a trap the moment the disrespect turned physical. She remembered her first day at Special Ops training. An instructor telling her that the most dangerous battlefield was never the one filled with enemy fire, but the one where you had to stay silent while being underestimated. She felt that lesson vibrating through her bones now. Her jaw clenched as she replayed the moment the cop cornered her in the cafeteria line, his voice low, smiling like he was doing her a favor when he told her people like her shouldn't be in restricted spaces. The shove that followed, then the punch she wasn't expected to survive. This wasn't just misconduct, it was a warning, a test, a humiliation crafted to push her into reacting. What they didn't realize was that they were the ones being observed. And somewhere above this building, a file with her real identity was already blinking with an alert, triggered by the violence she had just endured. The tension in the cafeteria didn't fade after the punch. It sharpened, like a wire pulled too tight, humming with the threat of snapping. Lena stood alone in a room full of uniforms, men with badges, men with rank, men who already decided she was guilty of whatever they felt like accusing her of. The officer who hit her, Chief Training Officer Mark Dwyer, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his expression twisting with something darker than anger. It was embarrassment. A man terrified not of what he had done, but that someone lower, someone he believed beneath him, might expose it. His face pulsed with humiliation, his shoulders stiffened. His chest expanded as he tried to reclaim dominance through posture alone. Behind him, the other officers watched with that careful stillness shared by people afraid to challenge authority, yet eager to witness someone else's downfall. Their crossed arms, tilted heads, and hushed muttering created a silent verdict. Whatever happened next, it would not be fair. The room smelled of overturned trays, cold vegetables, cheap meat, and tension thick enough to taste. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering just enough to make the scene feel unstable, like the building itself sensed something was about to fracture. Inside Lena, fear pressed against her ribs, but not the kind that makes a person run. This fear was quieter, more dangerous. The kind that came from knowing she had to endure whatever came next without exposing her true mission. If she retaliated, the entire operation would collapse. If she backed down, the abuse would escalate. If she revealed her badge, the undercover framework surrounding this precinct would shatter in seconds. Every option carried risk. Every choice could destroy months of federal work. And Dwyer sensed her hesitation. He mistook it for weakness. He leaned into it, letting the power imbalance settle like a weight across her shoulders. She could feel the room tilting away from justice, one silent step at a time. No escape. No allies. No witnesses who would dare tell the truth. And yet, deep beneath the fear, a flicker of something else stirred. A warning rising from instinct, telling her that this moment was only the beginning. Because while Dwyer believed he controlled the room, he had no idea someone outside it was already watching every second. Lena's breath steadied, but her fingertips trembled with the sting of the blow she had held back. Not from pain, but from restraint. Her eyes drifted toward the edges of the room, where the cafeteria staff had frozen mid-motion. One worker, an older janitor with tired eyes and a mop still dripping onto the tile, stared at her with quiet recognition. His eyebrows lifted just slightly, as if he sensed something about her that the officers refused to see. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But the way he shifted his weight, subtly aligning himself closer to her side of the room, felt like the first breath of humanity Lena had encountered since walking in. Her chest tightened at the small gesture. It reminded her of home, of the people who taught her to survive long before the government ever trained her. Her mind flickered back to her grandmother's kitchen. Warm light, slow simmering pots. A voice telling her that the world would test her in ways that required strength far beyond fists and muscle. It was the kind of memory that anchored her when the world tried to strip her dignity away. The memory vanished as quickly as it appeared. She was back in the cold cafeteria, surrounded by hostile eyes. Officer Dwyer stepped forward again, rolling his shoulders like a man preparing to reclaim his pride through force. The officers behind him exchanged glances, their body language shifting into something heavier, something that suggested they would let things continue as long as Dwyer wanted. One officer at the far table whispered something to the man beside him. Both laughed softly. The sound hit Lena like a slap. She tightened her posture, back straight, feet grounded, eyes steady, not defiant, not aggressive, just unbroken. The janitor noticed. His grip on the mop handle tightened. A slight shake of his head warned her to hold back, to survive this moment without giving them the excuse they were hungry for. And yet, she could feel it, the room's atmosphere shifting. A ripple in the social tension. Something small and subtle but distinct. The sensation that someone else had just entered the narrative, even if not the room. Lena didn't know if it was intuition or training whispering to her, but she sensed movement beyond these walls. A presence, a signal, something that hinted her silent endurance was about to matter. Because somewhere down the hall, a man carrying an unmarked tablet had just stopped walking, the live alert on his screen showing Lena's name. Down the hall, past two security checkpoints and a locked steel door, the man with the unmarked tablet froze. His breathing paused. His thumb hovered over the screen. A red notification pulsed beside a classified identifier, Lena Ward, level black clearance, flagged for physical threat detected. He knew what that meant. Anyone with that status wasn't supposed to be touched, not even bumped, not even questioned without authorization. and certainly not assaulted. He pivoted sharply, his shoes echoing through the corridor as he moved toward the cafeteria, fast, but not fast enough to change what was already unfolding. Back inside the cafeteria, Lena still stood alone. Her expression controlled, though a faint tremor settled along her jawline, a fatigue she rarely allowed herself to feel. She inhaled slowly, pushing air through tight lungs as she tried to balance fear with discipline. Her internal conflict grew louder with every passing second. Should she reveal her identity? Should she shut down the abuse before it escalated further? Or should she stay silent, maintain the cover, and protect the bigger mission, knowing full well that silence could come at the cost of her own safety? The stakes twisted around her like wire, her mission briefing replayed in fragments. This precinct was under federal scrutiny for internal misconduct. She was embedded to observe, not intervene. Her silence was supposed to expose patterns that were now beating against her skin, demanding a reaction. Officer Dwyer's shadow stretched across the tiles as he stepped closer. His expression had shifted from anger to something colder, something that made the room feel smaller. He wanted a reaction. He needed one. His authority wavered after striking her in front of everyone, and now he sought to reclaim it at any cost. He muttered something under his breath. The officers behind him stiffened, their arms crossing tighter over their chests. Their posture formed a wall not just physical but social. No one would contradict him. No one would intervene. The silence wasn't neutrality, it was permission. Lena sensed the trap closing in, not a trap set for her, but for him. He didn't know the walls around him were shifting. He didn't know the federal eyes he feared most were already turning his way. Her fingers curled slightly, just enough for the janitor to notice. He shook his head again, more urgent this time, warning her not to fall into the provocation. She exhaled, steadying herself on a knife's edge between endurance and collapse. Because just outside the cafeteria doors, the man with the tablet broke into a run, his badge revealing a rank no one here was ready to confront. The cafeteria doors didn't open. Not yet. The man with the tablet was still seconds away, and in those seconds the air inside shifted into something sharper. Lena could feel it. A tightening, a coldness, a collective inhale from the officers as if they were preparing for the next phase of whatever they believed she deserved. Officer Dwyer adjusted his belt, a subtle gesture of dominance. His chin lifted, his stare narrowed. His posture widened just enough to block her only clear exit path. Her facial expression stayed composed, but the tension around her eyes deepened. A stillness wrapped around her body, not surrender, not fear, but calculation. She scanned the room with the quiet precision of someone trained to map escape routes even while standing perfectly still. But every route was the same, blocked, guarded, watched. The environment turned claustrophobic. The buzzing lights took on a harsher tone, chairs scraped, boots shifted. The cafeteria's cheap tile made her feel exposed, spotlighted, trapped beneath the weight of 100 unspoken judgments. Dwyer took another slow step, then another. He wasn't rushing, he was savoring the moment. Behind him, a young officer whispered something to the man beside him. A nod, a smirk, a folding of arms that echoed the hierarchy pressing down on her shoulders. The atmosphere thickened into something oppressive, a pressure that didn't break bones but dignity, a kind of social gravity meant to reduce a person into silence. Lena's internal conflict tightened its grip. She could neutralize the entire room in under 30 seconds if she wanted to. Every muscle in her body knew how. Every instinct begged for release. But she wasn't here as an operative. She was here as an observer, a role with no weapons, no authority, no armor besides silence. The janitor shifted again, taking a single step closer, barely noticeable. But Lena noticed. His presence felt like a thread of humanity stretched across a battlefield. Still, the officers continued to close in. A slow, methodical encirclement, a boarding of territory that was never theirs to claim. The room had chosen its side, and it wasn't hers. Just as Dwyer lifted his hand again, the cafeteria doors jolted, someone powerful forcing their way in. The cafeteria doors didn't swing open yet, but the jolt against them was enough to ripple unease through the air. Officers glanced toward the entrance, their postures tightening for a moment before shifting back into a shield around Dwyer. And that brief flicker of hesitation only fueled him. His face hardened into something far more dangerous than anger. It was certainty. certainty that he still controlled the room, certainty that whatever, or whoever, was pushing against those doors could wait until he finished proving a point. He straightened, broadening his shoulders, lifting his chin, letting his authority swell like a heat wave across the room. Even without speaking, his body language announced a single message. He would not be questioned. Not by the officers behind him, not by the woman in front of him, not by anyone walking through those doors. His hand rose slowly, not to strike, but to gesture. A small wave, barely a flick of his fingers. Yet it sent 3 officers stepping forward, forming a half circle around Lena, tightening the walls even further. Her facial expression barely shifted, just a faint narrowing of her eyes, a soft tightening of her lips. But inside, a knot of fear twisted deeper. Not fear of pain, she'd endured worse, but fear of what this escalation could force her to reveal. Behind the officers, a few cafeteria patrons backed away. Their chairs scraped in nervous arcs across the tiles. A mother in civilian clothes pulled her teenage son aside, whispering urgently. But no one dared to intervene. They watched instead, as if witnessing a storm form over a single person's life. The atmosphere thickened with a choking stillness. Even the flickering lights seemed to dim, casting shadows that stretched long across the floor, pooling at Dwyer's feet as if magnifying his presence. He stepped closer again, close enough for Lena to feel his breath against her cheek, close enough for the room to fall into a silence that bordered on suspense. Her pulse drummed a slow, steady rhythm beneath her skin. Her restraint stretched thin like a fraying thread. And yet she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't react. That stillness enraged him more than any scream could have. He leaned in, voice low, muttering words only she could hear, words meant to break her spirit. Behind him, the doors rattled again, harder this time. Dwyer didn't turn, he didn't even blink. He was so focused on crushing her that he completely missed the shift in the officer's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, a quick dart toward the entrance, a tightening of grips on their belts. Something was coming, something they didn't expect. But Dwyer remained blind to it, drunk on the power he believed was unshakable. Because he still had no idea that the person about to enter outranked every badge in the room, including his. The cafeteria doors slammed open so hard the metal hinges groaned, but the sound didn't break the silence, it sliced through it. Every head jerked toward the entrance. Every shoulder stiffened. Every whispered breath froze midair. Except Dwyer's. He didn't turn, not at first. He stayed locked in his stance, chest puffed, dominance radiating from him like heat from asphalt. His attention clung to Lena as if humiliation were a doorway he planned to push her through. But the shift in the room was unmistakable. The officers' expressions faltered. Their arms dropped from their chests. A few stepped back instinctively, as though sensing a force none of them were prepared to challenge. Lena kept her face steady, but a tremor pulsed along her eyelid. A quiet recognition that the moment she'd been trying to avoid was crashing straight toward her. The man entering the room wasn't loud. He didn't bark orders or flash authority. He simply walked with a calm, controlled urgency that made the air bend around him. Black suit, plain tie, unmarked badge clipped at his belt, a badge only a handful of people on the West Coast could identify. His eyes scanned the scene with a single sweep. Lena, the officers circling her, Dwyer's looming posture, the broken plates on the floor, the redness around Lena's cheek where the punch had landed, and something in his jaw shifted. Not anger, but alarm. The kind that comes when a protocol breach is so severe it borders on catastrophe. He stepped further in, and for the first time since striking Lena, his confidence wavered. Just slightly. Just enough for a flicker of uncertainty to shimmer across his face before he masked it again with arrogance. He straightened his uniform, attempting a composed stance. But Lena saw the truth, the subtle tightening of his throat, the twitch in his jaw, the sudden awareness that someone was now watching him the way he'd been watching her. The suited man's gaze lingered on Lena's face. Not pity, not shock, recognition. He knew exactly who she was and exactly what this meant, but he didn't expose her, he didn't speak her name. He shifted his weight slightly, a silent signal she understood instantly. Stay quiet, stay still. Your cover holds for now. The officers exchanged looks. Their earlier amusement collapsed into confusion. Tension twisted into a new shape, one with fear threaded through its center. Dwyer tried to reclaim control. He took a step forward, forcing his voice into something steady as he addressed the newcomer, a gesture meant to reassert dominance. But the suited man didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge Dwyer's authority. He simply tilted his head, studying the chief officer like a scientist observing a malfunction. Lena inhaled slowly, sensing the shift. The humiliation was no longer hers. The imbalance was beginning to tilt. A crack had formed in the structure Dwyer believed was unbreakable. And in that crack, the truth about who she really was began to seep through, waiting for the moment it would explode. The suited man stepped closer, his shoes moving through the debris on the floor with a quiet, deliberate rhythm. Every tap against the tile deepened the fracture already spreading across the room's hierarchy. Dwyer's eyes flicked from Lena to the stranger, then back again, calculating, defensive, suddenly aware that the weight he'd been throwing around might not land the way he expected. His shoulders squared harder, his chin lifted higher. His authority became louder even though his voice had not yet made a sound. He gestured sharply for the officers to hold their ground, a command built on years of unchallenged obedience, but the officers hesitated. Their stance shifted. The wall they'd formed around Lena loosened, the symmetry breaking as uncertainty pushed through their rigid formation. Lena sensed the change instantly. Her breath deepened, her spine straightened. Her body language softened into something careful, ready to move but refusing to provoke. Her cheek still pulsed where Dwyer had struck her, a reminder of the humiliation she'd forced herself to endure. The ache wasn't the part that hurt. It was knowing she couldn't stop him then, not without jeopardizing everything she'd been sent to uncover. The suited man finally spoke, not through words but through posture. He lifted his badge just enough for Dwyer to see the edge of it, not the full emblem. A sliver of gold, a glimpse of authority far above local rank. Dwyer froze mid-breath. His face stiffened, expression tightening in a quick, involuntary wince before he masked it behind a forced smirk. He pretended not to recognize the symbol, but the flicker in his eyes betrayed him. He knew, or at least he suspected enough to panic. He muttered something to the officers, something meant to regain control, but his voice wavered on the last syllable, thinning under pressure. The officers exchanged glances again, the shield formation now visibly cracking. The suited man didn't flinch. He didn't move to assert dominance. He simply turned his head toward Lena, letting his gaze travel across the bruise forming on her cheek, the shattered plates under her boots, the tightened muscles in her shoulders. There was no pity in his eyes, only calculation and urgency. Lena felt the shift inside her chest, a knot loosening, a tide turning, a sense that the balance of power was not just shifting, it was about to snap. Across the room, the janitor who had silently supported her earlier took another small step back, as if preparing for a storm no one else in this room could yet see. Dwyer sensed the ground slipping beneath him. He stepped closer to Lena again, trying to force the narrative back under his control. His boots landed harder. His breathing thickened. His posture swelled with desperate aggression. But the suited man moved a fraction forward, barely a step, and the entire room reacted as if the floor had tilted. The officers straightened. The whispers died. The tension broke into a brittle silence. Lena inhaled, slow, steady. For the first time, the fear inside her didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a fuse. Because Dwyer was seconds away from discovering that the woman he struck was not the one in danger. He was. Dwyer's breath grew harsher, each inhale scraping the back of his throat like gravel. He felt the room slipping from his grip, and that loss of control twisted him into something uglier, something stripped of restraint and inflated by panic. He stepped closer to Lena, so close the heat from his body pressed against her skin. Her expression didn't move. Her eyes held steady. But the fine muscles along her jaw trembled with the effort of enduring a man who believed she was powerless simply because he wanted her to be. Dwyer's shadow smothered hers. His uniform stretched across his chest as he puffed himself larger. A performance, a threat, a last attempt at reclaiming the dominance he'd felt seconds earlier. He muttered something low and venomous under his breath, his words sliding into the air like poison. The officers behind him stiffened, not because they disagreed, but because they recognized the tone of a man leaning on hatred when authority started to crack. Lena felt every syllable hit her like cold rain. She didn't flinch, didn't recoil. Her body held perfectly still, the kind of stillness that comes from years of training under pressure. But inside, something fragile bent to the point of tearing. Shame, fear, helplessness tightening into a knot she could barely swallow around. The suited man watched Dwyer's escalation with a calm so controlled it bordered on terrifying. He didn't interrupt. Not yet. He needed one more piece, one more moment, one more slip that would finalize the case unfolding right before him. And Dwyer delivered it. He shoved Lena again. A harsh, deliberate push meant to knock her off balance, meant to prove that even in front of a stranger with a badge he half recognized, he still owned the room. Lena stumbled back a step. Not from weakness, but because she chose not to respond. Her restraint was the only thing more powerful than his aggression. A gasp rippled across the cafeteria, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to break the illusion of unanimous support. A young female officer stepped forward instinctively, her hand hovering near Dwyer's arm as if her body reacted before her training could stop her. Her expression tightened with something like alarm. Her gaze flicked between Dwyer and Lena with hesitation that hadn't existed minutes earlier. Even the janitor reacted. His mop clattered against the bucket as he lifted a hand halfway, uncertain, but unable to watch silently anymore. Dwyer's eyes widened at the shift. He recognized the moment the room's unspoken loyalty fractured. Fear crept into the corners of his expression, subtle but undeniable. He turned sharply to the officers, barking a harsh mutter meant to reestablish control. But the command fell flat, met with hesitation, side glances, raised eyebrows that said the authority he weaponized had started to rot. Lena steadied herself, feet planted, breathing quiet and controlled. Her fear was still there, but now it stood beside something else, something rising, something waiting. The suited man stepped forward just enough for his shadow to merge with Lena's. Not invading, not rescuing, just aligning. A signal only she could fully understand. The balance of power was shifting, and Dwyer felt it like a drop in temperature. Because the next words out of the suited man's mouth would begin the unraveling of everything Dwyer thought he controlled. The suited man finally spoke, but not loudly, not dramatically. His voice carried the calm weight of someone who had no need to raise it to be heard, and that alone changed the atmosphere. The word he uttered wasn't a name, wasn't a command. It was a classification, a quiet identifier that only someone with federal clearance would understand. And Lena understood it instantly. Her pulse skipped, not from fear, from recognition. It meant he was taking over. It meant the mission had reached a turning point. It meant she was no longer alone. Dwyer blinked, thrown by the unfamiliar tone. His confusion flickered into irritation, then into something sharper, fear disguised as anger. His shoulders stiffened. He squared himself as if preparing for a confrontation he still believed he could win. But the suited man didn't move toward him. He moved past him, a clean, controlled step that placed him directly between Lena and the ring of officers. A placement that shifted the social gravity of the entire room. Lena watched him carefully, a slight lift in her chin, a faint softening in her shoulders, not relief but readiness. This was the moment she had hoped to avoid, but now that it was here, she embraced it with a steady internal calm. The officers, not all at once. In slow stages, first the jaw loosening, then the cheeks tightening, then the eyes widening with forced denial. He tried to speak. Only a breath came out. He swallowed hard, attempting to rebuild his authority. But authority built on intimidation collapses quickly when real power enters the room. His next muttered command to the officers had no weight. None of them moved. Their eyes stayed fixed on the suited man. Lena stood still, letting the moment unfold. Her breathing steady, her expression controlled. Her internal fear settling into something deeper, a silent endurance finally shifting toward its breaking point, because she knew what came next. The exposure, the unraveling, the consequences for what he had done. The suited man finally turned slightly, his voice quiet but unmistakably final. Whatever he said didn't need volume, its meaning seared through the room like a blade. Every officer stiffened, every whisper died, every gaze sharpened. This wasn't just an intervention. This was the beginning of an investigation, and Dwyer felt the collapse start beneath his feet, because the next protocol step would force Lena's true status into the open and end any illusion Dwyer had of surviving this untouched. The suited man didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice, but he shifted his stance. Just one controlled, precise movement, and the entire room felt the weight of it. Federal protocol had begun, a protocol none of these officers had ever seen executed in real time. The suited man lifted his tablet higher, allowing a faint glow to illuminate the badge clipped at his belt. Not fully, just enough. A glimpse of an emblem that didn't belong in a local precinct cafeteria. A ripple of unease slid through the officers. Boots shifted. Hands twitched. Eyes widened with quiet recognition they weren't ready to admit. Dwyer tried to step forward again, but the suited man raised a single hand, not even toward him, just upward, and the chief officer froze as if the air had thickened around his shoulders. Lena watched the shift unfold. Her eyes softened. Her breath steadied. Her spine loosened from the rigid tension that had held her captive minutes earlier. But she also felt the danger. Because once protocol escalated to this point, her identity, her entire mission, was no longer under her control. The suited man turned slightly, angling the screen so Lena could see it. Her clearance code flashed softly, pulsing like a heartbeat. A silent confirmation the moment had come. He muttered something in a low tone meant only for her, not instructions, reassurance. A reminder to hold steady through what came next. The officers behind Dwyer leaned in, trying to catch a glimpse of the screen. They couldn't make out the details, but the tension in the suited man's posture told them everything they needed to fear. Dwyer's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His breathing grew shallow. A bead of sweat slipped down his temple despite the cafeteria's cold air. He muttered something defensively, a denial wrapped in shaky authority. The officers didn't echo him. They didn't move. They watched him with a distance that hadn't existed earlier, as if preparing to step away from a man about to fall through the floor. The suited man finally addressed the room, not loudly, not angrily, just firmly. His tone transformed the atmosphere into something clinical, the sound of a process beginning, one that none of them could stop, one that documented, investigated, and dismantled careers. Lena stood still through it, her eyes lowered, not in submission, in acceptance. The humiliation she endured was shifting into something else, something heavier. The moment everyone would learn who she truly was. Dwyer's lips parted as if to protest again, but the suited man cut him off with a simple gesture. A gesture that sent a cold, electric silence snapping through the cafeteria. The ultimatum, a procedural step no local officer could ignore. Lena felt her pulse in her fingertips. The next seconds would decide everything, her cover, her mission, Dwyer's fate. Because the next protocol step required Lena to show the one thing she never wanted revealed in this room, her federal credentials. Lena didn't move at first. Her hands stayed at her sides, fingers relaxed but tingling with the weight of the moment she had been trying to avoid since she walked into this building. Her breath steadied into a slow, deliberate rhythm, the kind she'd been trained to use when stepping into dangerous territory with no way back. Every eye in the cafeteria shifted to her. The officers' faces tightened with confusion. Their posture leaned forward, arms loosening from their earlier crossed stance. They were finally beginning to realize that something irreversible was unfolding, something none of them had authority to interrupt. The suited man held his tablet angled toward her, silently insisting on what came next. Protocol demanded identification, real identification, the level that erased every assumption made about her in this room. Lena lifted her gaze. Her facial expression didn't show anger. It didn't show triumph. It showed restraint, a steadiness carved out of fear, humiliation, and years of learning how dangerous the truth could be in the wrong rooms. Her shoulders straightened, her body aligned perfectly as if bracing for impact not from a punch but from revelation. The atmosphere thickened. The cafeteria seemed to shrink. Even the buzzing fluorescent light quieted, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Dwyer watched her with eyes that flickered between confusion and growing dread. His breathing hitched. His lips parted in a shallow inhale. His confidence, already cracking, began to crumble in silence, because she wasn't reacting like someone afraid of consequences. She was reacting like someone trained to face them. The suited man looked at her again. A small nod, permission. Necessity. The moment had come. Lena reached slowly toward the pocket of her training pants, the same pocket where she had kept her identification hidden under layers of bureaucratic clearance. Her hand moved with a calm that made the entire room tense. Not a single officer spoke. Not a single boot scuffed the tile. The janitor in the corner pressed a hand to his mouth, eyes widening as if he'd been watching a woman walk a tightrope no one else believed existed until now. Dwyer's jaw clenched. He muttered something desperate under his breath, a warning, a denial, a final attempt to stop whatever this was before it exposed him. But it was too late. The suited man shifted his body between them, blocking Dwyer's path without a word. Lena paused with her hand on the pocket seam, the final beat before a truth detonates. Her fingers pressed into the fabric. Her breath drew in. Her identity, her real identity, sat inches away from changing everything. Because once she pulled that credential, the humiliation she endured would transform into a documented assault on a federal operative. And Dwyer's downfall would begin not with shouting, but with silence. And just as her hand began to lift the credential out, a second federal alert pinged on the suited man's tablet, confirming that higher authorities were already mobilizing toward the precinct. Lena's fingers slipped into her pocket, brushing the smooth, rigid edge of the credential she had never intended to reveal here. Her breath slowed. Her pulse steadied. The years of training wrapped around her like armor, pulling her upright in a room that moments earlier tried to strip her dignity bare. She drew the badge halfway out, just enough for the metallic surface to catch the cafeteria lights. A thin flash of silver, a hint of the embedded seal, not fully visible, not fully declared, but enough to make several officers inhale sharply, their bodies recoiling as if someone had dropped a live wire between them. The atmosphere cracked, hard, sudden, violent in silence. Every officer instinctively adjusted their stance, shifting weight, lowering hands from belts, straightening posture. It was the subconscious response of people who just realized they weren't dealing with a civilian, not a visitor, not a trainee, not a woman they could shove into silence. But Dwyer, his reaction split the room. His face twitched, first with disbelief, then with denial, and finally with the kind of panic that doesn't come from fear of punishment but fear of exposure. He stepped forward too quickly, too aggressively, trying to reclaim control in a moment no longer his. But the suited man moved faster, a single step, a raised hand. No contact, yet the gesture halted Dwyer like a wall had materialized between them. The cafeteria watched the collapse unfold in real time. Dwyer's authority, once swollen, once loud, flickered like a light losing power. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat, coming out thin, unanchored, unbelievable. Because truth had entered the room and it didn't need a raised voice to be heard. Lena lifted the badge fully now. The seal glinted. The embedded identifier shimmered beneath the fluorescent lights. Federal Special Operations Division, a level of clearance. He had not just crossed a line, he had obliterated it. The suited man tapped his tablet. A tiny sound, barely audible. But the notification that followed sent a ripple through the air, a pending investigation marker, automatically triggered by Lena's badge activation. It meant the incident was no longer local, no longer manageable, no longer possible to bury. Dwyer stood frozen, his downfall beginning not with an accusation, but with the realization that the system he weaponized now had full authority to turn against him. Lena lowered the badge slowly, her expression steady, her dignity reclaimed piece by piece in the silence that surrounded her. The power dynamic was no longer shifting. It had flipped, completely, irreversibly, because the next step, mandated by federal protocol, would force Dwyer into the one position he had spent his entire career avoiding, being publicly removed from his own command. The room shifted the moment Lena lowered her badge, not just emotionally, physically, as if the air thickened, pressing down on every officer who had stood against her moments before. Dwyer stumbled back a half step, a movement so small yet so revealing it cut through the cafeteria like a fault line splitting open. His face, once hard and certain, sagged with disbelief. His jaw trembled. The confidence he clung to bled out of him one drop at a time. He tried to speak. A breath, a stutter, then silence. Not the silence of control, the silence of someone realizing they have none left. The officers around him watched with wide, unblinking eyes. Their posture shifted all at once, back straightening, hands folding behind them, expressions flattening in a desperate attempt to distance themselves from the man unraveling before them. Lena stood centered in the storm, her breathing calm, her gaze steady, her face no longer carrying the fear of a trapped woman, but the composure of someone reclaiming every piece of dignity stolen from her. Her body relaxed into a stance that told the truth without needing words. She was no victim. She was the highest-ranking operative in the room. The suited man clicked another command on his tablet. A sharp tone chimed, a digital signature of activation. A federal internal affairs lockout, one designed to freeze a precinct's authority chain the moment misconduct crossed into criminal territory. The sound hit Dwyer harder than any punch ever could. His shoulders slumped, his breath quickened. A sheen of sweat formed at his temples, dripping slowly down the side of his face. He lunged forward, not violently but in desperation, a man scrambling to stop a fall already in motion. The suited man didn't need to touch him. A single step into Dwyer's path brought him to a halt, a wall of authority disguised in calm posture. The cafeteria officers exchanged silent glances, fear, shame, uncertainty twisting their expressions into something brittle. Their earlier smirks vanished, their earlier confidence drained, their earlier complicity exposed by the weight of the badge Lena had revealed. Several of them shifted into formal posture, as if bracing for inspection. A few lowered their heads. One quietly stepped backward, realizing that what happened here might end careers beyond Dwyer's. The janitor watched from the corner, his eyes softening as he took in Lena's composure. He seemed almost relieved, as if the truth he suspected had finally surfaced through the cracks of injustice. Dwyer's voice finally broke free, but it came out fractured, an unstable mutter, a denial collapsing faster than he could form the words to support it. He tried blaming procedure. He tried framing Lena as uncooperative. He even tried to shift responsibility to the officers around him. But every word fell dead in the air. No one echoed him. No one nodded. No one stepped to his defense. He'd spent years building a fortress out of authority. Now he stood inside its ruins. Lena didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough to dismantle him. Because he finally understood what he hit. Not just a woman, not just an outsider, but a federal agent whose presence here meant one thing. This precinct had been under investigation long before today, and his assault just handed them everything they needed. And as federal vehicles began pulling into the precinct parking lot, Dwyer realized the worst truth of all. His downfall wasn't just beginning, it was already documented. The sirens didn't howl. There were no flashing lights. Federal vehicles arrived the way true authority always does, quietly, efficiently, without asking permission. Through the cafeteria windows, dark SUVs rolled into the precinct lot in a controlled formation. Their engines barely hummed, yet the sound carried an unmistakable message. This was no longer a local matter. Inside, the officers stiffened. A wave of realization washed over them, not loud, not panicked, but deep enough to carve itself into their posture. Their arms lowered, their expressions tightened, their confidence drained until only dread remained in their eyes. Dwyer turned toward the windows, his face collapsing as he recognized the vehicles. His throat bobbed in a hard swallow. His shoulders curled inward, as if his own uniform suddenly weighed too much to wear. He muttered something frantic, a breathless attempt to justify himself, but the words died halfway out. Even he didn't believe them anymore. Lena watched him quietly, her breathing calm now, her gaze steady, her body no longer bracing against a threat, but observing a disintegration she had predicted long before this day. Because this wasn't just a reaction to a punch. This was the endpoint of a pattern she had been sent here to expose. The suited man stepped aside slightly, allowing Lena a clear view of the entrance. Another silent message: you are not the one being summoned. You are the one they came for. Not to question, not to detain, to protect. The cafeteria doors opened again, this time without force. 3 federal supervisors entered, their presence chilling the room like a sudden drop in temperature. No uniforms. No weapons drawn, just controlled authority radiating from posture and purpose. They scanned the scene with slow, methodical eyes. Lena, the bruise on her cheek, the shattered plates, the officers who had formed a circle around her. And then Dwyer. Their gaze lingered on him the longest, enough to make him step backward until his spine hit a cafeteria pillar. One supervisor tapped a device on his wrist. A small chime echoed. Another digital lockout triggered, this one freezing Dwyer's entire command access. Radio privileges, internal system controls, rank authority, silenced in an instant. The officers heard the chime and fell into deeper stillness. The silence wasn't compliance anymore, it was fear of association. Dwyer's chest heaved. His lips quivered. The certainty he once weaponized now shattered across his face in shards of disbelief and desperation. He tried to speak to the supervisors. A plea, a defense, a lie forming too slowly to matter. They didn't even look at him. Instead, their attention returned to Lena. And in that moment, every remaining question in the room died. Her status was clear. Her authority outranked them all. And whatever operation she represented had now taken full control of their precinct. Dwyer's breathing broke into uneven gasps, small, panicked, powerless. He clutched the front of his uniform, as if gripping it could keep his rank from slipping off his chest into the abyss forming beneath him. Lena lifted her chin slightly, not in triumph, but as someone reclaiming space she had been denied minutes earlier. Her dignity stood solid again, rebuilt by truth instead of restraint. The federal supervisors exchanged a brief, silent nod, not to her, to each other. A confirmation that everything they needed to proceed was already in the room. Because in the next minutes, Dwyer wouldn't just lose authority. He would learn the reason Lena was truly here and how long she had been watching him. The federal supervisors didn't approach Lena first. They approached the scene. The shattered plates, the bruising on her cheek, the tightened circles of officers who once surrounded her like wolves. Everything in the cafeteria had become evidence. One supervisor lifted a small scanner, sweeping it across the floor. Its quiet beeps echoed softly, marking every fragment, every footprint, every disturbance as part of a larger story. A story Lena had been collecting piece by piece for months. Because she hadn't come here to train. She hadn't come here as a visitor. Her presence wasn't accidental. She was here because of Dwyer. The supervisors turned to him, and his entire body recoiled, his back scraping against the pillar he had earlier leaned on with confidence. His breathing turned shallow, each inhale a desperate attempt to steady a life that had already slipped through his fingers. The suited man stepped beside the supervisors and rotated his tablet toward them. Dwyer's lips parted in a tremble. He tried to deny it. His head shook. His hands lifted in frantic gestures. But denial couldn't erase what was already documented, a mountain of misconduct tracing all the way back through his years of service. The officers around him shifted. Their faces changed subtly, the widening of eyes, the stiffening of spines, the shame of those who once stood confidently at his side, now blinking under the weight of what they had just learned. Lena watched, her expression solemn. She wasn't celebrating his downfall. She was witnessing justice take its first breath. The supervisors continued scrolling until they reached the bottom of the file, the newest entry. Added minutes ago. Time-stamped, location-stamped, video-stamped the cafeteria incident, his punch, his shove, his aggression, his abuse of authority in front of witnesses. Dwyer stared at it, his face paling into something hollow. Not fear of punishment, fear of exposure. Fear of losing the power he had built his identity around. And then the worst part hit him. His voice cracked. His legs weakened. He looked at Lena with dawning horror, finally understanding what he had really struck. She wasn't here by coincidence. She wasn't some trainee he could intimidate. She wasn't someone he could shove into compliance. She had been assigned to watch him, investigate him, document him, and he had walked straight into the trap his own behavior created. The supervisors turned to Lena, not to question her, to acknowledge her. Her cover had served its purpose. Her endurance had collected the final piece of evidence they needed. Dwyer sagged against the pillar, the last of his authority melting away. He whispered something, a broken mutter of disbelief, a plea to no one in particular, a final attempt to grasp a life already collapsing. But nothing could save him now. He wasn't just losing his badge. He was becoming the centerpiece of a federal case. Because the next step wouldn't just remove him. It would expose him, publicly and permanently, in front of every officer who once feared his power. The supervisors did not speak to Dwyer first. They didn't need to. Their silence had become a verdict long before their words would make it official. One of them lifted a compact recording module from his coat, a matte black device that activated without a sound. A red ring glowed around its edge, signaling that everything from this point forward would be preserved, reviewed, and archived into a permanent federal record. Dwyer's knees buckled. Not enough to make him fall, just enough to show that his body finally understood what his mind still fought against. His career wasn't slipping. It was ending. The officers, his officers, stood straighter now, each one instinctively distancing themselves from the man they once followed without question. No one moved to support him. No one offered comfort. No one stepped forward to defend him. Loyalty dissolved the same way power does, fast, silently, and without warning. The cafeteria's atmosphere shifted into something cold and ceremonial, like a courtroom forming itself around him without walls or benches. The nearest supervisor turned slightly, addressing the room in a tone that carried the weight of procedure rather than emotion. Every syllable dropped like a stone hitting water. Documented, verified, acknowledged. Lena remained still. A single bruise shadowed her cheek, but her posture stood taller now, anchored not by the authority she revealed, but by the dignity she reclaimed. She watched Dwyer with steady eyes. Not vengeful, not triumphant, just present, a witness to a reckoning she had neither rushed nor resisted. The suited man tapped the tablet, releasing a final protocol. A loud chime echoed across the cafeteria. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't dramatic, but everyone recognized it instantly. Suspension order, immediate, irreversible, enforced. Dwyer's badge vibrated against his chest as its internal lock disengaged. The magnetic clasp released. The metal emblem slid from his uniform and hit the floor with a small, devastating clink. The room froze. It wasn't the volume of the sound that mattered. It was what the sound meant, a career collapsing into a piece of metal lying at Lena's feet. Dwyer grabbed the front of his uniform as if trying to hold on to authority with his bare hands. His breathing fractured into shallow gasps. He shook his head repeatedly, muttering disjointed pleas that he didn't know, that she provoked him, that he acted in the line of duty. But none of his words carried weight anymore. They drifted into the air like dust. Ignored, unbelieved, irrelevant. The officers who once flanked him now stepped aside to form a path not for him, but for the supervisors advancing toward Lena. For the first time since she entered this precinct, every gaze in the room shifted toward her not as an outsider, but as the highest authority present. Dwyer's voice cracked as he reached out, not toward her, but toward the badge on the floor, the last symbol of the life he had just lost. A federal supervisor placed a foot gently over the badge, preventing him from touching it. Not harsh. Final. The cafeteria felt impossibly quiet, as if the building itself was absorbing the collapse of a man who spent years believing he was untouchable. Because the very next moment would reveal why Lena had been assigned here, and how deeply Dwyer's downfall would shake this precinct. The cafeteria felt frozen in time. Not a chair moved, not a fork clinked. Even the flickering fluorescent light seemed to hold its breath as the supervisors encircled the fallen badge at Dwyer's feet. The suited man finally spoke, calm, quiet, controlled, and explained what no one in this precinct had known until now. Lena Ward hadn't been placed here for training. She hadn't been rotating through divisions. She was not a recruit, nor a visitor, nor a misassigned operative. She was the lead investigator in a long-term federal audit targeting precinct-level abuses of power. And Dwyer, the man who shoved her, struck her, humiliated her in front of his own officers, was the subject at the center of it all. A wave of realization rippled through the room. Certain officers shifted with visible shame, their gazes dropping to the floor as the truth settled over them like ash. A few stepped backward, suddenly aware of their complicity, their silence, their laughter, their folded arms now preserved in a federal record that would not forget them. Others stood rigid, stunned into stillness as their perception of Lena shattered and reformed in an instant. And Dwyer, he collapsed against the pillar, legs weakening as though the weight of every accusation in his past had finally landed all at once. His breathing came in shallow bursts. His hands trembled violently as he pressed them against his knees. The suited man continued scrolling through the file. Decades of misconduct, patterns of targeted aggression, unfiled complaints, intimidated civilians, internal reports mysteriously marked resolved without signatures. And then the worst section, unauthorized disciplinary drills, officers pressured into silence, trainees threatened with retaliation. a hidden system of favoritism and fear that turned the precinct into a hierarchy of obedience rather than justice. Lena had documented it all, quietly, carefully, enduring every slur implied, every corridor blocked, every unnecessary order thrown her way. Her humiliation today had not been a miscalculation. It was the final waveform, the last unchecked behavior the investigation needed. A real-time incident where Dwyer revealed himself exactly the way countless civilians had described him. But this time it was on camera, on record, and committed against someone the federal system would protect. The supervisors approached Lena now. Their expressions carried professional respect, a silent acknowledgement of endurance, restraint, and the emotional weight of carrying a mission that demanded her silence until the very end. She stood still, face steady, but something inside her softened. A quiet exhale, a release of fear she had carried for far too long. The supervisor closest to her gave a subtle nod, signaling what came next. She was no longer undercover. Her role was shifting from observer to declarant. The case would move from shadows to courtrooms. Behind them, two federal agents moved toward Dwyer. Not to restrain him, not yet, but to initiate a procedure that officers dread more than handcuffs, full public suspension with external oversight. Dwyer's eyes widened as the agents approached. His voice cracked into a plea. He reached out as if outside more federal vehicles rolled in. Inspectors, legal officers, protocol teams. This precinct was no longer his. It was an investigation site. Because the final step still waited, Lena's testimony, the formal charges, and the moment Dwyer would face the truth about the woman he tried to break. The cafeteria slowly drained of noise as federal teams fanned out through the precinct. Clipboards, evidence kits, encrypted scanners, every doorway became a threshold of accountability. Every hallway echoed with quiet footsteps, the sound of a system finally waking up. Lena stood near the center of the room, not elevated, not spotlighted, simply present, steady, grounded in a dignity no one could take from her again. A supervisor approached her with a digital recorder. Not aggressive, not urgent, just procedural. He asked her to step aside for formal testimony. She walked with slow, controlled steps, the bruise on her cheek catching the light with each movement, not a symbol of weakness, but a mark of what had been endured long enough to bring a hidden truth to the surface. As she sat before the recorder, her posture remained upright. Her hands rested lightly on the table. Her breathing stayed even. Her voice, calm, precise, unwavering, began to recount the events of the day, not with emotion, not with anger. With clarity, every shove, every muttered insult, every officer who laughed instead of intervening, every moment she chose restraint over reaction. Every second she protected the mission rather than herself. Her words became the spine of the case. Her silence earlier became the evidence. Her endurance transformed into the very force that brought the investigation to its conclusion. Meanwhile, in the cafeteria, Dwyer was escorted out under full observation protocol. The walk felt longer than any he had taken in his uniform. Each step carried an echo of shattered authority. No applause, no resistance, just the cold, factual record of a man whose power had finally met its boundary. Officers watched him go with mixed expressions, some ashamed, some stunned, some questioning their own roles in the culture that allowed him to thrive. The janitor stood quietly by the pillar, eyes soft and reflective. When Lena passed by later, he gave her the smallest nod, a gesture of respect, acknowledgement, and gratitude. A reminder that even in places built on intimidation, humanity still finds a corner to stand in. The day stretched forward into hours of documentation. Lena provided statements, validated digital records, and submitted the last pieces of her undercover work. She felt the exhaustion settling into her bones, the emotional toll of months spent hiding in plain sight. Yet beneath the fatigue lay something steady and warm, not victory, peace. Peace in knowing the truth was no longer hers to carry alone. When the sun dipped low outside the precinct windows, a supervisor approached her with a final clearance code. It signaled the end of her assignment. Her work here was complete. As she walked toward the exit, federal teams continuing their work behind her, Lena paused at the threshold. She turned once, not to look at the officers, not to look at Dwyer being processed in the distance, but to look at the empty space in the cafeteria where she had stood alone hours earlier. Her fear had lived there, her humiliation, her silence, her endurance, but not anymore. She stepped out of the building with a straight spine, the cool evening air brushing against her face like the closing of a heavy door behind her. The precinct, once a place where she was told she didn't belong, now rested under the authority she represented. And Dwyer, who once believed he could break her, would spend years answering for every action documented against him. Her story didn't end with revenge. It ended with truth, with justice, with the quiet power of someone who refused to let oppression define her path. And as she walked away, the precinct would rebuild under new oversight. But they would never forget the day a silent operative exposed the deepest rot in their foundation.